We are continuing our study of the prophets. And up to this point, we have covered 6. That means, according to my math, which isn't great, that we're halfway through. That either excites you or, makes you feel a little dismayed. Like, oh, we're only halfway through. Or, wow, we're already halfway through. Just however you want to take it. So today, we're going to cover a rather interesting figure. I know you're all excited. Like, which one is it? Who could it possibly be? Well, if you had the handout I gave you last time, you would know who it is. Obadiah. I know, everyone's favorite prophet. So, we've already gone through Jonah. That was a while ago. We all know the story of Jonah, right? God sends him to go and declare his message of judgment against the Assyrians. Then we have Amos, who takes, he is called to pronounce judgment against Israel. We have Hosea, who sort of expands on what that judgment is going to look like and why God is judging Israel. And then we have Micah, who is living through the Assyrian invasion. So we have a nice little progression as we go through the 8th century, what I'm calling the Assyrian prophets. Then we have our chronology, how they're all kind of lined up. Then we have our 7th century Babylonian prophets. So, of course, Nahum is kind of right in the middle of the 7th century. He's looking back on the destruction, but he's also looking forward to someone new who's coming, which, of course, is the Babylonians. We have Zephaniah, who initially pronounces the judgment against Judah by the Babylonians. We have Habakkuk, who raises the question about whether or not the Babylonians coming to judge Judah is just or not. And now we're going to kind of conclude this section with Obadiah and a judgment against Edom, which, if you were following the logic, because I think there is a logic there's a kind of progression, that feels like a left curveball. Like, why are we shifting gears to talk about Edom all of a sudden? Well, that's why we'll get to that. So there are 2 problematic prophets. Now, I need to clarify, because there's a lot of problematic prophets. But there are 2 prophets that are problematic when it comes to dating. So, I've got my beautiful chronologies that I'm very proud of. But and for the most part, we are in general agreement. I say we're talking about evangelical, conservative, traditional scholarship are pretty much in lockstep with generally where all the prophets line up, based on the information that we're given, but also traditions and so on, like linguistic dating. There's all kinds of technical stuff that you don't care about, you don't need to know. But there are 2 prophets that they just do not agree with. And behind the scenes, they're like cats just going at it. Like, they just lose their minds. It's Obadiah and it's Joel. So these 2, no one agrees on. We'll get to Joel when we get to Joel. But Obadiah, so the reason why Obadiah is so problematic is, first of all, there's no background on the guy. He doesn't tell us who's king, which might be a hint that there is no king, possibly. He doesn't give us any hints as to when he is writing, although that's not entirely true. All he talks about is Edom. So here we've got verse 1, the vision of Obadiah. Nothing else. We don't get the name of his father. We don't get where he's from. We don't get, Obadiah, who was a prophet during the time of whenever. Nothing. Just a name. And then this is what the Lord has said about Edom. So this is an oracle against Edom. Not against Israel, not against Judah, not against the Assyrians or the Babylonians, against Edom. Hold your questions. So, why? Why on earth are we getting an oracle against Edom? Why is an entire book about Edom? This frustrates everybody. So the logical assumption, which I'm building up sarcastically, is that this must be a response to something Edom did. So what the standard scholarship approach is, well, we have to figure out when was Edom a problem? And it's easier to say when were they not a problem? But we've got all kinds of options. So we know that Edom was involved in Absalom's revolt. We know they're involved during Shishak's invasion, during the time of Ahab, during the time of Jehoram, Jehoash, Ahaz, Jehoiakim, before the exile and even after the exile. So Edom is fairly consistently a thorn in Israel's side. This doesn't really narrow it down for us. That said, there are three primary dates. You've got, I say dates, during the time of Jehoram, during the time of Ahaz, and during the siege of Jerusalem. So for conservative evangelical scholarship, it's usually about these three dates. We'll call them the early date, the middle date, and the late date. So the early date, right, that would put us here firmly in the period of the divided kingdom. This would put him during the reign of Jehoram. I know that that is not a king you're all particularly familiar with, but if I say Elijah and Elisha, you know who they are. So he would be ministering towards the end of Elijah's ministry and kind of right at the beginning of Elisha's ministry. That puts him pretty early, especially for a writing prophet. Elijah was primarily involved during Ahaz's reign, who's kind of before Jehoram, and Elisha is kind of picking up during Jehu and past that. So again, that would put Obadiah kind of between those two. Then you've got the view that he's ministering during the time of Ahaz. So that would put him basically contemporary with Micah. We can remember back to Micah. That would also put him during the time of Isaiah. So he'd be another one of kind of in that period. But the third view, and of course I'm saving the third for last, or the best for last, is that he's ministering during the siege of Jerusalem, which would put him right after Habakkuk, and then during the time of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Now, I said, I kind of fibbed a little bit, because I said there aren't any textual clues. There is a major clue, and this is going to be kind of where I line up. So in verse 11, on the day you stood aloof, on the day strangers captured his wealth, while foreigners entered his gate and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were just like one of them. Well, when did enemies ever cast lots for Jerusalem? It seems like it has to be referring to the Babylonians destroying Jerusalem. And so I go with the late date, that he is ministering during the siege of Jerusalem. This would make him sort of the Babylonian equivalent to Micah, right? Because Micah was ministering during the siege of Israel. Now, you may think, well, that's it, okay? That's it, that's done. But the thing is, during this late date view, you've got two additional options. I know, it just never stops. But scholars have to scholar, and they have to argue about things. So, the siege, right? There's a before the siege, and then there's an after the siege. Before the siege, you have Jeremiah, who's ministering up to the actual destruction of Jerusalem. He dies kind of not too long after. But then you have Ezekiel, who is ministering after, right? He goes into the exile. And both of them are kind of, not really exilic, but turn of this period prophets. Here's the question. So if we go with the late view, which again, I think is the best option, I think it's the strongest option, within that view you have to ask. I'm going to call them the old man view and the young man view. And I know the picture's misleading, forgive me. The old man view is Obadiah is roughly contemporary with Jeremiah. He's an older guy, he's been ministering for a while, and his book is written in anticipation of the destruction. Young man view. He's a younger guy. I know, that's, if you couldn't figure that out. He's about the same age as Ezekiel. And he's actually writing after the destruction, looking back on the destruction. So, is he an older guy, contemporary with Jeremiah? Is he a younger guy, contemporary with Ezekiel? And I remember when I was first putting my charts together, I took them to the two Old Testament professors at Criswell. I was showing them my charts. And, of course, when I showed them to them, they both had to say, well, you know, Obadiah and Joel. Yes, I understand. We understand. Like, those two are the problematic books. And both of them said, well, you got Obadiah a little late because he's contemporary with Jeremiah. I'm like, well, but there's all these new arguments, and there's this and that, and they both wouldn't lose their ground. Like, they're both like, no, he's contemporary with Jeremiah. Like, you can't put him with Ezekiel. I put him with Ezekiel. So that's where we're going to go, and I'll explain, and we're going to go into why. Because I think Ezekiel is a much better option, is a much more important option. So we'll get to that. But why Jeremiah? Why do people like Jeremiah so much? Well, because the book of Obadiah, which is not very long, about 21 verses, has a lot of parallels to Jeremiah 49. In fact, it's so close, one might think that one is based on the other, or one is more familiar with the other. Now, the thing, though, is Jeremiah is a pretty prominent guy. He's a very important guy. And it seems to me more reasonable that Jeremiah is probably the bigger preacher, the more famous preacher, and Obadiah would base his book on Jeremiah, not the other way around, which means, unless my logic is flawed, which, I'm crazy, so it could be, Jeremiah has to be first. Right? Obadiah has to be younger, he has to be coming after Jeremiah in order to have heard Jeremiah and then base his book on Jeremiah's teachings. And I just don't really like the idea of Obadiah being before Jeremiah. So I don't think Obadiah is older or he's before Jeremiah. There's the other issue, and I'm going to stick to this. This is not rooted in any biblical argument, but I like the idea, and I think it's rather compelling, that if Jeremiah is a major figure, which we know that he is, and he's ministering in Jerusalem up to the siege, dying not too long after, that is a ministry void that needs to be filled. Now, we know in the exile, Ezekiel becomes one of the more prominent religious figures. But what about in Jerusalem? What about those who are left behind? Surely we have figures, leaders, prophets, and so on, who are picking up the pieces, who don't go into exile, like Ezekiel does. So is it possible that Obadiah is one of those who've been left behind and to try and deal with the casualties after the fact? I like that idea, and I like the idea that, again, he's very influenced by Jeremiah's ministries, even possibly basing his letter on one of Jeremiah's sermons. So I put, here's my relative timeline. As you can see, I put Obadiah and Ezekiel together on the same line, right at the turn of the century, just immediately after the destruction of Jerusalem. That makes them both captivity prophets, exile prophets. Here on this timeline, which they're all together, you can see Obadiah and Ezekiel are just nicely lined up, one on top of the other. And so with that in mind, and I'm going to cement why it's so important that Obadiah is a contemporary with Ezekiel, because I think, just bear with me on this. So the book of Jeremiah, and it is clearly a judgment against Edom. That's just the whole book. Edom needs to be destroyed. The outline, it's hard to outline a book that's 21 verses, because it's all about Edom, but in the first 14, we have a very specific focus on Edom. On 15 and 16, you've got this sort of acknowledgement of the other nations, and then in 17 to 21, you do have a nod to the promise of deliverance for Israel, which all this would make sense if he's writing in a time that we're assuming. Now, I mentioned the problem with dating, but there's another problem. Why do we care? And going through commentaries, this is a really interesting question. In fact, most commentaries don't want to bring it up, because there are two books. I mentioned this at the time, and I'm mentioning it now even more. There are two minor prophets that are really hard to justify. Why are they in the Bible? Why do we care they're in the Bible? Of course, it's going to be Nahum and Obadiah, and I know they're your favorite books. You love these books. You read them all the time. Now, the reason why they're hard to justify is because of how specific they are. Nahum dealing with the aftermath of the destruction of Israel, right, from the Assyrians, and Obadiah dealing with Edom. Well, these are very historically centric books, dealing with very specific moments in time that we have not lived through. So do these have any significance for us today? I think they do. I think there's a reason why they're here. But Obadiah is probably the worst of the two because we get so focused on the historical context. I even mentioned that you've got all of these options for when the book could have been written based on the engagements between Edom and Israel. But again, this assumes a very historically focused book dealing with some very specific historic grudge that we just don't have knowledge of, right? He doesn't tell us that God is angry because of something that they did, that there was part of a rebellion or they were fighting against King Ahaz or whatever. We don't know. We're not given the context. So why? And what's funny is I didn't really wrestle with this the first time I was kind of working through this book because I kind of already came up with an answer, didn't realize I had an answer. So the question, why do we care? We're gonna try and resolve this question. So of course the book, I've already mentioned, but it's about Edom, and we already know that Edom is kind of been on the chopping block. Obadiah is not the only book to bring judgment against Edom. So going to our judgment of the nations, I've mentioned this before, Amos, Zephaniah, who makes sense, right? Because there are two kind of judgment prophets, Amos bringing judgment to Israel, Zephaniah bringing it to Judah. But those two, as well as the three major prophets, all have these judgments against the nations, and all of them, with the exception of Zephaniah, which is frustrating. I don't know why Zephaniah doesn't mention it, but all of the others specifically mention judgments against Edom. So Edom clearly has this long-standing rivalry, and the idea that God's going to bring judgment against Edom has been a long-coming issue. But this doesn't resolve the question of why we need an entire book. Maybe this is compensating for Zephaniah not mentioning it. I don't think so. I think the clue, and I've become increasingly more convinced of this, I think the clue is from Ezekiel. So Ezekiel does something really, really interesting. This book is 21 verses long. I got to stretch it out in some way. Ezekiel gives us a long oracle against the nations. He's got Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, and Egypt. And it's about what we'd expect, right? He goes through, he talks about their grievances, their sins, their flaws, and so on, that God is going to bring judgment upon them. The most famous of which, of course, is his discussion on Tyre, which we believe was fulfilled under Alexander the Great. Great, good stuff. He then moves on, right? No. So after he goes through his oracle against the nations, he does something that no other prophet does. He goes back to Edom. So chapter 25 is his sort of stereotypical, by the numbers, judgment against the nation of Edom, just like Isaiah does, just like Jeremiah does. Chapter 35, however, is different. We have a second judgment that is rather different in tone. Why? Why give us two judgments when no other prophet does? And why spend so much time on the second judgment as opposed to the first judgment? Are these just different sermons? Well, we're going to kind of walk through this. We're kind of, jump around a bit, but in chapter 35 it begins. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, turn your face toward Mount Seir and prophesy against it. Say to it, this is what the Lord God says. So he loves the phrase Son of Man, which has all kinds of interesting implications. And right off the bat, right, because this is our second judgment against Edom, he's not directly bringing judgment against Edom. He's judging Mount Seir. Now, Seir is the main peak in Edom. Edom is kind of this blob territory, but it's around this big mountain, which is Mount Seir. Why preach judgment against a mountain? That's odd. Now, this isn't the only time that Ezekiel does this. He's actually told multiple times to preach judgment against the mountains. Ezekiel is preaching against creation itself. He's been given the authority to preach against creation. That's why he's the Son of Man. That's what I believe, at least. That he has the authority to bring judgment on creation. So it's not Edom, we'll get to that. So he's preaching against the mountains, right? This is one man bringing judgment upon creation. Verse 3, look, I am against you, Mount Seir. I will stretch out my hand against you and make you a desolate waste. I will turn your cities into ruins, and you will become a desolation. Then you will know that I am Yahweh. So here we have a nice little map. You can see the dark green is Edom, and in the sort of western blob there, that the whole thing is Mount Seir. It's a pretty big chunk of the territory. Verse 5. Because you maintained an ancient hatred and handed over the Israelites to the power of the sword in the time of their disaster, the time of final punishment, therefore, as I live, this is the declaration of the Lord God, I will destine you for bloodshed, and it will pursue you. Since you did not hate bloodshed, it will pursue you. So, he brings up the ancient bloodshed, right? He brings up the ancient rivalry, which, of course, has to refer to Jacob and Esau, right? So, he's bringing judgment against the land creation itself on account of the rivalry of Jacob and Esau. And we're not Obadiah, we're talking about Ezekiel. Scholars are divided exactly on the nature of the second judgment. So, if he is just speaking about the nation of Edom, first of all, why not mention the nation of Edom? But also, why do it a second time, right? We already have the judgment in chapter 25. The alternative is, well, what if he's talking about, or what if he's using Edom as this sort of vague catch-all for all of the nations? Got a few scholars, a few commentaries who go with that. The problem is, why Edom? If you want one nation to symbolize, at least politically, nationally, all the enemies of Yahweh, why Edom? Why not use Babylon? Why not use Egypt? Why not use a more prominent and politically significant villain? Why use Edom that we don't care about? Because I don't think it's about the nations. I think we're talking about this ancient hatred, this ancient rivalry that's being presented, encapsulated by Jacob and Esau. So, we have Adam, right? And Adam has his two sons. He's got Cain, and he's got Abel. I know we're kind of rehashing Genesis. And right off the bat, right, he has two sons. One offers the right sacrifice, one offers the wrong sacrifice, one kills the other. And we now have essentially two lines. And this is going to be cemented in the book of Genesis. I'm going to throw out one verse. It's problematic, but that's okay. In Genesis 6:4, you've got the Nephilim were on the earth, both in those days and afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of man, who bore children to them. I don't think we're talking about fallen angels mating with humans. I think it's a rather silly view. We don't need this verse to make the point, but this is just what I believe, that what we're talking about is we're talking about the two lines. We have the heirs of Seth, the godly line, and we have essentially the daughters of Cain. So we have these two lines, one's godly, one's not, and they're intermingling, which is basically diluting the two bloodlines and polluting everything. So there's not two lines anymore, there's just one line and the whole world become corrupted. So we essentially have two lines, right? We've got the line of Seth, the line of Cain, and this is going to move down and it's going to be reestablished under Jacob and Esau. Just kind of follow me with this. So we've got the two lines, right? We've got Jacob, we've got Esau. Back to Ezekiel. I will make Mount Seir a desolate waste. I will cut off from it those who come and go. I will fill its mountains with the slain, those slain by the sword, and fall on your hills. In your valleys and in your ravines I will make you a perpetual desolation. Your cities will not be inhabited. Then you will know that I am Yahweh. Because you said, these two nations and two lands will be mine, and we will possess them through the Lord, though the Lord was there. This is what the Lord God says. While the whole world rejoices, I will make you a desolation, just as you rejoiced over the inheritance of the house of Israel, because it became a desolation. So I will make with you, you will become a desolation, Mount Seir, and so will all Edom in its entirety. Then they will know that I am Yahweh. So here we have the language back of inheritance, right? They're rejoicing over the lack of inheritance. This seems to very much evoke the Jacob and Esau rivalry, right? Because Jacob wanted the inheritance, it goes to Jacob, Esau's upset he doesn't get it. We can kind of debate over what exactly the inheritance is referring to. Is it talking about the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the Davidic covenant, and so on? But my position, just to kind of summarize, is what Ezekiel is talking about here. He's not talking about the nation. He's not talking about a national rivalry, that Edom is a political entity in opposition to Israel. They're not the Philistines, right? They have those. Edom is something different. Edom is something special. Edom represents a spiritual rivalry, going all the way back to these two lines, going back to Jacob and Esau, right? So you have Isaac. He was supposed to pass on the covenant of Abraham. He has two sons. He can only give it to one. He gives it to Jacob. Esau, right, who also wants a blessing, but he doesn't get it. And so we have the two of them effectively representing two sides of this inheritance. You got the true heirs of Abraham, and you've got the false heirs of Abraham, essentially. And they're being represented on a political level between the nation of Israel and the nation of Edom. So what I'm calling this is an apocalyptic view of Edom. Essentially, Edom represents this wicked line. So when Ezekiel is bringing judgment on Edom, at least this second time, he's not talking about the nation so much as the spiritual nation of the wicked line. So I think in 25, yes, we have a political judgment, but in 35, we're talking about a spiritual judgment. That's the distinction I'm making. I'm rather happy with this distinction. That's why we have the two, and that's why he's going to single out Edom and talk about Edom in a way he doesn't talk about anyone else. So, bearing that in mind, that Ezekiel, and I think it is Ezekiel, who is sort of putting this apocalyptic spin on Edom, right? Raising it and talking about it in this, I don't want to say allegorical way, I'm avoiding that word, but he's using Edom as a way of describing this entity that is populated by the false heirs of Abraham, essentially, right? The false line. Obadiah is a contemporary, right? So he's living, operating at the same time, and I don't think it's a crazy idea that they're on the same page or that they've been influenced by each other. So I'm going to argue that moving forward, so since the destruction of Jerusalem, we're going to see Edom used in a more spiritual way. Edom does not just refer to the physical nation, but is actually going to be used as a designation for this evil line, kind of the false inheritance. There aren't too many prophets that talk about it this way. So Ezekiel being, I think, the best example. Obadiah, I think, is a very strong example. Maybe Joel. We'll get to Joel. Malachi, I am convinced. I think Malachi, because he will bring attention to Edom in a way that no one else does. And I think it makes the most sense we're talking about it again in this sort of apocalyptic kind of way. So with that in mind, we are finally in Obadiah. And the reason why we're setting all that up and why it's important is because I don't think we're simply talking about the physical nation of Edom, this political entity, this country that just borders the sort of southeastern edge of Judah. We are talking about something spiritual. We're talking about the theological significance of this line of Isaac that claims inheritance that they don't deserve. So, this is what the Lord has said about Edom. We talked about the different options. Is it a country? Is it a catch-all for the other nations? Or is it something else? I think it's referring to this, again, this false line of Esau. Moving on from verse 1, we have heard a message from the Lord. A messenger has been sent among the nations. Rise up and let us go to war against her. Look, I will make you insignificant among the nations. You will be deeply despised. We've already had plenty of judgments against Edom. This is nothing new. So verse 3, your presumptive heart has deceived you, you who live in clefts of the rock, in your home on the heights, who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? We're being very specific, focusing our judgment on Edom. This language, very haughty, it's poetic to an extent, but the idea that you're lifted up, you're exalted, you're haughty, you don't think anyone can touch you. We've seen this before, particularly in the Psalms. Verse 4, though you seem to soar like an eagle and make your nest among the stars, even from there I will bring you down. This is the Lord's declaration. I've already mentioned that a lot of Obadiah seems to resonate with Jeremiah, right? And this is why so many think that there's a direct connection, which is not a bad argument. But what gets overlooked, and I'm kind of shocked at how much it's overlooked, is that we do have parallels to Ezekiel. So Obadiah is not just picking from Jeremiah. He seems also, I think, influenced by Ezekiel. There's a couple of places, but perhaps most notably is Ezekiel 17, where we have the allegory of the eagles. And in this allegory, which he tells us is an allegory, is he's telling this story about, this eagle who flies, and he picks up this cedar shoot, and then he carries it off to the land of the merchants, and then there's a new vine which is carried off by a second eagle. So it's this very symbolic, very bizarre kind of story. And how do we know it's an allegory? Because at the end of the story, he tells us it's an allegory and then tells us what he means by the allegory, which is the shoot is Jerusalem, the first eagle is Babylon, who's carrying them off to Babylon, that's the captivity. And then there are some left behind who are going to be carried off by the second eagle, which is Egypt. So we have plenty of flowery, elaborate language that resonates with this, and again, that kind of overlaps with Obadiah. Verse 5, if thieves came to you, if marauders by night, how ravaged you would be. Wouldn't they steal only what they wanted? If grape pickers came to you, wouldn't they leave some grapes? How Esau will be pillaged, his hidden treasures searched out. That's fairly straightforward, right? And we're just kind of describing the judgment. Verse 7, everyone who has a treaty with you will drive you to the border. Everyone at peace with you will deceive and conquer you. Those who eat your bread will set a trap for you. He will be unaware of it. Verse 8, in that day, this is the Lord's declaration, will I not eliminate the wise ones of Edom and those who understand from the hill country of Esau? Tamam, your warriors will be terrified, so that everyone from the hill country of Esau will be destroyed by slaughter. This is pretty elaborate judgment, but we've got the wise ones who are going to be eliminated. We have the terror brought upon the warriors of Taman, and just a description of the desolation. Verse 10, you will be covered with shame and destroyed forever because of violence done to your brother Jacob. This is rather interesting, right? That we're getting a judgment or declaration of judgment because of violence done to Jacob, when we're not told exactly what the violence is. We're not given a specific moment. So if this is tied to one specific event, we're not told what that is, right? And again, he's going to bounce back and forth between the, we'll say, literal national language of Israel versus Edom, but he'll also evoke more symbolically the rivalry between Jacob and Esau. So it's not entirely allegorical, I don't want to say that, but you can see the overlap of this, right? You've got the two, we'll say, nations on one hand, but you also have the lasting, enduring rivalry of the two brothers, Jacob versus Esau. And my point is I don't think he's really all that concerned with the national rivalry. I think what he's more concerned with is the spiritual rivalry, that you have the spiritual heirs of Jacob who have endured this lasting maltreatment by the spiritual heirs of Esau. And so this rivalry that goes all the way back to Genesis has never really gone away. It's just endured. It's been prolonged. Verse 11. On the day you stood aloof, on the day strangers captured his wealth, while foreigners entered his gate and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were just like one of them. So this is just a really fascinating book. We don't give enough credit for what it's doing. Edom is not given credit for the destruction of Jerusalem. They didn't do it. That's not the violence that he's concerned with. Someone else did it. This seems to be a very explicit reference to the siege and destruction, which happened by the Babylonians. Edom, however, who was not involved in that, are gloating. They're happy it happened because we're paralleling the Edom as representatives of the wicked line with Israel as representatives of the godly line. They are gloating over what has happened because since Jerusalem is gone, right, since that city has been destroyed, the nation's been destroyed, they can think, well, now the inheritance is finally ours, right? The inheritance that has been hoarded by Judah, right, that they took from us, right, going all the way back to the rivalry of Jacob and Esau, it's gone. And so now we can claim our rightful place as the true inheritors of that promise, going all the way back to Isaac, right? So they want to take what is not theirs. That's the offense. It's not that they destroyed Jerusalem. They didn't do that. Babylonians did. It's that they think they can move in now and claim the inheritance that was never theirs to begin with, the inheritance of Isaac. So, yeah, the siege, 597, I'm just convinced that we are dealing with this moment, right, the late date. This also, is it possible that he's contemporary with Jeremiah looking forward? This is all kind of predictive. I guess so, but again, as I've said and as I've tried to explain, I think it's much more satisfying and makes much more sense that we're dealing with someone after the event looking back on it, kind of reflecting on it, and also someone who's been pretty heavily influenced by both Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And so it helps when studying Obadiah and reading Obadiah to at least have some background in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, because they are two very significant prophets. They're major prophets for a reason. Verse 12, do not gloat over your brother in the day of his calamity. Again, we're paralleling these two peoples, right? The descendants of Esau, the descendants of Jacob, but we're superimposing this ancient rivalry of the two brothers, right? So Jacob has been, within the context, right? Jacob has been destroyed, right? The city is gone, Jerusalem is gone, and now the descendants of Esau, the heirs of Esau, are gloating because they think now the blessing is ours, now the inheritance is ours. And Obadiah is saying, nope, you shouldn't do that, don't gloat. He's not the first prophet to tell us, to warn us, don't gloat over your fallen enemy. Various prophets have kind of mentioned this or hinted at this. Probably the most pronounced is Micah, when he's saying, don't announce it to the Philistines when Israel is finally destroyed, because they're going to gloat, and we're not supposed to gloat over our enemies. Less directly, we've seen prophets say, both of the enemies, don't gloat when Israel's destroyed, don't gloat when Judah's destroyed, but also to the Judeans and the Israelites, don't gloat when your enemy's destroyed, because this is divine judgment, right? There's a story, I have not been able to track it down. It's a great story. I'm going to butcher it because I don't remember the finer details. I just remember kind of in general. My father would tell a story. There was some election. It doesn't matter when or who was involved, but it was a very heated, very just no-holds-bar slugfest of an election. These two candidates were just vicious against each other. Not that we can compare this to anything today, but it was particularly vicious, and it got a lot of attention just how bad these two candidates were at it. And then in the middle of the campaign, one of the two candidates got a really bad diagnosis, like cancer or something. And almost immediately, the attack stopped. And so a reporter asked the other candidate, what happened? Why'd you let up? And the response, all I remember is the response. I don't remember who the two candidates were. I don't remember anything about it except the response. And this is the one, this is the other candidate, so you got the one who's got the cancer or whatever, and then the other one said something like, sir, when God puts his hand on someone, you take yours off. That's a great line. When God is bringing his judgment, we don't heap on that, right? Because this is God intervening, this is God dealing with the situation, and you have to just let God deal with it, right? You don't gloat, you don't beat it into the ground. Now, again, this goes both ways, right? We're talking about Israel, Judah. You don't gloat when God destroys Assyria. You don't gloat when God destroys Babylon, but also to the enemies, right? When God destroys Judah or brings judgment on Israel, you don't gloat about that either, because this is God dealing out his judgment, and you just have to accept it. So verse 12, do not gloat over your brother in the day of his calamity. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction. Do not boastfully mock in the day of distress. Again, because this is not proof that Judah is gone, right? This is not proof that God's will with Judah is over, right? This is not proof that they no longer have the inheritance, that they no longer have the blessing of Isaac and Abraham. This is just God dealing with them, right? Do not presume to understand what the extent of this judgment will be. This does have application for us, because we often don't behave this way. Often when our enemies do get they're just desserts, we tend to want to gloat about that. I think Jesus on a couple of occasions says, don't be that way, right? We're not supposed to act that way. In fact, we're supposed to love our enemies and want to bless them and so on. Although he also says, love your enemies because it'll be like heaping coals on their head, which I'm getting mixed messages on that one, right? Verse 13, do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their distress. Presumably this is referring to, the Babylonians have destroyed Jerusalem, and now Obadiah is saying, don't go in there and loot, right? Don't go in there and take advantage of the situation and go in and, try to take what isn't yours. That's bad. God is not going to like that. Yes, you do not gloat over their misery in the day of their disaster, and do not appropriate their possessions in the day of their disaster. Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off their fugitives, and do not hand over their survivors in the day of distress. And I don't think we can ignore the significance that this, again, we're superimposing a couple of things. We've got the national situation, right, of the destruction of Judah with the nation of Edom, which I think is symbolic of the spiritual heirs of Jacob and the spiritual heirs of Esau. But we also have this ancient rivalry. So we're talking about two brothers, right? Two brothers that don't necessarily get along. When I was younger, there were plenty of people in the church who could not miss the opportunity to make the joke. I don't know how many times the joke was made. Particularly the assistant pastor had to just love to make the joke. So whenever Jacob and Esau were brought up, be like, Jacob and Esau, well, they didn't like each other almost as much as James and Joey don't like each other. So we were constantly compared to Jacob and Esau. If Joey had the opportunity, he probably would have stabbed me in the back. So yes, my brother and I have a Jacob and Esau kind of relationship. We joke about it. We know what it is. We know what we have. But we do have this framed as this sort of brotherly rivalry, right? Your brother that you don't particularly have the best affection for is in trouble. You don't take advantage of that, right? You don't go and loot his house when bad things happen to him, that sort of thing. Verse 15, for the day of the Lord is near against all the nations. So this is foreboding. Now, I'm not going to call Obadiah a day of the Lord prophet, because he's not. He just kind of has this little, he's dipping his toe in this. He's giving us this very vague, foreboding little hint, right? Something is coming. He's not going to elaborate. He's not going to develop this. He's just kind of throwing this out there. We already have had our two main Day of the Lord prophets. We had Amos, right, the Assyrian Day of the Lord against Judah, or Israel. We had Zephaniah, our Day of the Lord prophet against Judah, right, the Babylonian Day of the Lord. But a third Day of the Lord is coming, right, the final Day of the Lord. Now, we won't get that until Joel. He's the one who's really going to elaborate and explain what's going on. But even as far back as Obadiah, which is another reason, just keep heaping up reasons, why I think Obadiah almost needs to be after Zephaniah. Because we had our first Day of the Lord prophet, right? That was Amos. He was back before, in the 8th century. We had our second Day of the Lord prophet, right? That was Zephaniah. But now, those two are done, right? We're moving on. Israel has been judged. Judah has been judged. But the third judgment is coming. So verse 15, the day of the Lord is near against all the nations. As you have done, so it will be done to you. What you deserve will return on your own head. So the day of the Lord, this third day, which is getting hinted at, isn't going to be against Israel, because Israel's already been judged. It's not going to be against Judah. Judah's already been judged. This third day of the Lord is going to be against everyone else, right? And at this point, it makes perfect sense to understand that it's not just against the nation of Edom, right? Because we're not really talking about just the nation of Edom. That would be silly. Why have an entire book about just the nation of Edom? We're clearly talking about something broader, something more significant than that. We're talking about, again, everyone else, right? Those who are not part of the line and inheritance of Abraham. Those who think they are, who act as though they are, and who delight in the destruction of the righteous because they think this either elevates them or will empower them in their own way of life and so on. So this is clearly broadening this out, right? yes, Judah has been destroyed, but you're coming next, right? Judgment is coming for everyone else. Verse 16, as you have drunk on my holy mountain, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and gulp down and be as though they had never been. Verse 17, but there will be deliverance on Mount Zion, and it will be holy. The house of Jacob will dispossess those who dispossessed them. So we've already seen this. It's not clearly laid out because he's not really going to delve too deep into any one issue other than the judgment of Edom. But Mount Zion, who in our historical context has just been destroyed, is going to be delivered, right? So something is going to happen. Mount Zion is going to be restored, and Mount Zion is going to endure whatever happens next, right? So there needs to be the restoration, there needs to be return from exile, and when this final day of the Lord does happen, Mount Zion is going to endure, right? So the situation will be reversed. And this judgment, right, Zion has been judged, Edom has been spared. But when the next judgment comes, everyone else is going to get destroyed, but Judah, Zion is going to be spared that day. Again, he doesn't elaborate on that. That's what Joel is for. Verse 18, then the house of Jacob will be a blazing fire, and the house of Joseph a burning flame, but the house of Esau will be stubble. Jacob will set them on fire and consume Edom. There will be no survivor. Therefore no survivor will remain of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. I love this picture because it kind of looks like they're kissing, but also looks like they're wrestling. Like, do they hate each other or do they love each other? And the answer is they're brothers. So, you know, they do both, right? But again, like, he loves going back and forth between this. So he's dropping the pretense of national political language, and we're just talking about the two brothers, Jacob and Esau, right? Jacob will be a fire, right? A restoring, purifying fire. Joseph, which is, you know, the descendant of Jacob, the most godly of the brothers of the sons of Jacob, you know, they're going to consume, and the house of Esau, right, which currently stands, is going to be destroyed. And by Esau, I don't think we're just talking about Edom, and we're not really just talking about the person of Esau either, right? We're talking about the ungodly line. We're talking about those who have not been granted the true inheritance of Abraham and Isaac, but who want to take it for themselves. Verse 19, people from the Negev will possess the hill country of Esau. Those from the Judean foothills will possess the land of the Philistines. They will possess the territories of Ephraim and Samaria, while Benjamin will possess Gilead. So we have this expansion. The Negev is just the desert south of Judah, the hill country of Esau. We have this inclusion of the Philistines, which is an odd inclusion up to this point because we really haven't talked about other territories. Philistines obviously being on the western side of Judah, right? So Edom is on the eastern side, right? Other side, you get the Philistines. The Philistines are a political entity, right? They don't have the same spiritual, theological significance to Israel's history like the Edomites do. But they do have an ancient rivalry, right, going all the way back to the time of David. They are a historic enemy, and they also are a very symbolic enemy. They will possess the territories of Ephraim and Samaria. Those are to the north, while Benjamin will possess Gilead. The exiles of the Israelites who are in Hala and who are among the Canaanites as far as Zarephath, as well as the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad, will possess the cities of the Negev. So I mentioned, right, at the beginning I said that there really aren't any contextual or historical clues, and I said, well, that's not entirely true, right? We have the reference to, you know, don't gloat over the gates being destroyed, which I feel like is a really strong indication that we're dealing with the aftermath of the destruction of Jerusalem, as I've said repeatedly. But here we also have a reference to those in exile from Jerusalem, which seems to imply, I would say, at least certainly adds credence to the view that we're dealing with the Judean exile, which means we're post the Babylonian destruction. We're already in the captivity period, which means that we're in Ezekiel, the Ezekiel-Daniel time. Otherwise, that's a really odd thing to say, the exiles of Jerusalem. Like, when else would that apply if not during the Babylonian captivity? Now, we have these three references. We have Hala, Zarephath, and Sepharad, which, it's fun to talk about them. So Zarephath, we know where that is. So that's a coastal town. It's near Tyre. That's the yellow, right? Hala is somewhere in northern Mesopotamia. The best guess seems to be it's somewhere near Haran, which is up there. It's in the blue, right? So it's somewhere near Haran, north of Nineveh. That's our best guess. But scholars are pretty sure it's somewhere in the blue. Like we can't really narrow it down because it's probably a small community and we just don't have evidence of it anymore. So we generally know where Hala is. We do know where the Zarephath is. Now, Sepharad, we just have absolutely no idea. The dominant view is that we're talking about Sardis, which is a city, that's the red in the top left. That's a city in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Sardis is not too far away from where historic Troy should be. So just kind of giving you context. That's the dominant view. That's pretty far out there. I don't know why there are exiles out there. The second view is that we're dealing with a city in Media, where the Medes are from. So that's to the east, right? That's that big blob. Where in Media that would be, we don't really know. The third guess, which I don't know quite where we're getting this from, is that we're talking about a city in Spain, which that's not even on the map, right? That's way, way on the other side of the Mediterranean. How on earth they got to Spain at this point in time, I have absolutely no idea. The point seems to be that wherever this city is, it's about as far on the map as you can possibly be geographically. Like it's like when Jonah says, I want to go to the last stop, and they say, well, we can go to Tarshish. It's just kind of almost abstractly just the farthest place you can possibly go, right? It's the last stop. So we don't really know where Zarephath is. It is a long way away, right? So we got Judah, which is the orange down at the bottom. Edom is the green. Wherever Sepharad is, it's a long, long way away. And the point is, right, that God is going to bring back the exiles. Right? He's going to bring back those who are near, right, like in Zarephath. He's going to bring those who are, Hala probably refers to the Assyrian captivity. So even those who are still, enduring the captivity of the Assyrians, they're going to be brought back. And even those, scattered to the very farthest edges of the known map, they're going to come back as well. So that seems to be the point, right? So those who are near, those who are still, captured by the Assyrians, and then those on the very farthest reaches of the map. Verse 21. Saviors will ascend Mount Zion to rule over the hill country of Esau. So not only is Mount Zion going to be restored, not only is it going to endure, but Mount Zion is going to ultimately rule over the territory of Esau, right? So whatever Esau has will be subjugated by the heirs of Jacob, right? So those who belong to the false inheritance, right? Because again, I take this as more spiritual. The spiritual heirs are going to be taken over by the true heirs of Jacob. But even though Jacob is ultimately going to rule over Esau, which goes back to Genesis, right? That's all firmly established back there. We do get this final line, but the kingdom will be the Lord's. Now this is interesting, right? This is interesting because we're affirming a kingdom. But we're affirming a king without necessarily a king, right? Because Judah is gone. Judah has been wiped out, presumably. Now, if we're dealing with an earlier period of time, then the question is, well, wouldn't the king, wouldn't David's heir be ruling in Jerusalem? Well, not if there is no king anymore, right? Not if that's been taken care of. So the kingdom will be reestablished. But when the kingdom is reestablished, God's not going to turn it over to just some heir of David. He is going to rule himself, which we've already, like, well, I don't know about that. Well, Micah already told us this is going to happen, right? So back in Micah 2, in fact, this is kind of the whole point, that one of the main reasons why God is bringing judgment against Israel and ultimately against Judah is because he is going to destroy everything so that he can rebuild it, and then once it's rebuilt, he intends to rule himself. So Micah 2:13, one who breaks open the way will advance before them. They will break out, pass through the gate, and leave by it. Their king will pass through before them, the Lord as their leader. This is just one verse, but there are plenty of others. Basically, in this moment, he's describing that when the Assyrians come, it's Yahweh who's leading them. Yeah. It's not the Assyrians just coming on their own. Yahweh is leading the Assyrians, and he intends, once Israel's firmly judged, and later Judah, he's going to remain and he's going to rule afterward. So, as just a fun little kind of synopsis, because we've finished up our second set, right? We have our first set, second set, and there is a nice little symmetry that we have, because with Jonah, right, we have the judgment against the Ninevites. With Amos, we have the day of the Lord, the pronouncement against Israel. With Hosea, we have an entire book dedicated to the unfaithfulness of Israel. And then with Micah, we have the pronouncement of judgment against the northern tribe, right, against northern Jacob. And then in our second set, which we've now just finished, we had Nahum, which is dealing with the aftermath of Nineveh, and also the promise that God is going to finally wipe out Nineveh. We have Zephaniah, who is dealing with the day of the Lord against Judah, right, that God is going to bring judgment against them. With Habakkuk, we're dealing again with the unfaithfulness, right? That is God just? Even though Judah is unfaithful, is it really proper for God to, is bringing the Babylonians really the right way to deal with this? And then now with Obadiah, we have judgment. Although now it's not, because the judgment has passed, right? We believe, at least I believe, that Jerusalem has been taken care of. But the assumption is, what is the extent of that judgment, and what does that mean looking forward? Which is that God is going to bring out judgment against the other nations, right? Against Esau and his heirs. So, that concludes our Babylonian section.